Yo, what's good? Welcome back to the KKC podcast. Today's
How
episode
was I
is gonna be.
crack-a-lacking?
Shit. We'll edit that. Um, Today's episode is gonna be a little different. Instead of covering something quick or light, we're diving into a serious piece of American history that a lot of people only briefly learn about in school: the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II.
Oh,
But
excited to
this
talk about it.
yeah. But this episode isn't just about history. It's also about what history means today. Because when you look closely what happened, you realize something that's honestly kind of unsettling. Few people inside the government and media did actually try to speak out against the policy. Because when you look closely what happened, you realize something that's honestly kind of unsettling. A few people inside the government and media actually did try to speak out against the policy. They tried to stop it, but most of them were ignored. And that raises a bigger question we're going to explore today. If something like that happened again, who would stop it? Or more importantly, or if something like that happened again, would anybody stop it? And more importantly, who would stop it?
Yeah, that's what makes this story so interesting because when we think about injustices in history, we usually think of someone powerful stepped in to stop it, but that doesn't happen in this case. And when it doesn't, the responsibility shifts somewhere else to regular people paying attention.
So let's rewind back to 1941. When most people think about World War II, they imagine massive battles overseas, tanks in Europe, bombing soldiers fighting across the Pacific. But for Americans at home, the war looked very different. Until one day it didn't. The turning point was the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fear spread extremely quickly across the country. People were worried about spies, sabotage, and the possibility of more attacks. Oh, shoot. But instead of focusing on actual evidence, suspicion began quickly targeting an entire group of people, Japanese Americans.
And the most important thing here to remember is that most of them were actually American citizens. They were born in the US, they had businesses, farms, grocery stores. Their kids went to American schools. But after Pearl Harbor, suddenly a lot of Americans began seeing them as potential enemies.
Not long after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed something called the Executive Order 9066. This order allowed the military this order allowed the military to remove people from certain areas in the United States that were considered military zones. On paper, this order did not mention any specific race, but in reality, it almost exclusively targeted Japanese Americans. Over 120,000 people were forced to leave their homes.
And they weren't even given that much time either. Some families just had only days to pack. And they could only bring what they could carry. Everything else, their homes, farms, businesses, all that was left behind.
All that. Okay. Imagine being told you have to leave your house in 2 days. You can't take your furniture, you can't keep your business, you can't protect your property. You grab a suitcase and hope you pack the right things. That's what thousands of families had to do. Many tried to sell their businesses before leaving, but buyers knew they were desperate. So decades of work were sold for almost nothing. Entire neighborhoods emptied.
And when these families arrived at the camps, they found something completely different from the lives that they had built in America.
No, you're
So
still on
completely different from the lives that they had built and from their everyday lives. There were barbed wire fences, guard towers, armed soldiers watching them. It's completely different from the lifestyle they're used to.
Inside the camps, the families lived in a small barracks. Oh my god. Schools were set up for children. Communities tended to try to function as normally as possible, but the reality wasn't possible to ignore. They were prisoners, and the most confusing part for most families was that no crime had been committed. They were imprisoned because of their ancestry.
Just imagine being a kid in that situation, going to school every day, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, while soldiers guard the camp you're living in.
One of the most surprising parts of this story is what happened next. Despite being imprisoned by their own government, many Japanese Americans volunteered to serve in the U.S. military. One of the most famous units were the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was one of the most decorated military units in U.S. history. What do you think about that, Dexter?
Well, they actually became one of the most. Wait, you stole my line.
Yeah, because the tone I had like a tone where I was gonna continue. I had to say something.
I mean, that's really incredible when you think about it. They were imprisoned in these camps, or pretty much imprisoned, and at the same time fighting for the same country that put them in these camps.
Wow, that's deep. That's insightful. Now here's the part that doesn't get talked about as much. There were actually people who tried to stop the internment. Some lawyers challenged the policy in court. Some journalists spoke out. Some government officials warned that the policy was unnecessary. For example, the newspaper Bainbridge Island Review openly criticized the removal of Japanese Americans from the community.
And that was a very bold move at the time. Most newspapers at the time were supporting the government's actions because of the war. But this paper ultimately reminded readers that the people being removed were their friends and family and neighbors.
Oh yeah, I mean yeah, they were their friends and families and neighbors. There were also people inside the government who resisted the policy as well. One example was Francis Biddle. Francis Biddle pushed back against
Francis
large.
Biddle.
Yeah,
That cannot be a real person. Someone made that up.
it's got to be a real person. Biddle pushed back against large-scale internment in Hawaii. Military leaders wanted to imprison around 20,000 Japanese people there, but Biddle, in an act of heroism, argued strongly against it, and in the end, only 1,500 people were actually. That's crazy. Were actually interned in Hawaii.
And when you think about the population of Hawaii, 1,500, still a lot of people. A lot
Yeah,
of people on that island.
a lot of people on that island. Yeah.
However, there were still 100,000 people on the mainland that were still in prison.
Yeah, some Japanese people, in addition to these people, and in addition to Francis Biddle, some Japanese Americans also challenged the policy legally. Um, One of the most famous cases was this guy named Fred Korematsu. Korematsu refused to report for relocation, and his case eventually reached the Supreme Court. But in 1944, the court ruled against him and upheld the government's actions. What do you
Uh,
think, Dexter? What do you think about this?
and that ruling just shows how powerful the fear was at that time. Even the highest court in our country supported the policy.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, not amazing. That's so terrible. So here's where the bigger lesson comes in. When we look back at history, we often assume that when something wrong happens, someone powerful will step in and stop it. But the internment camps show something different. People did speak out. Journalists questioned it. Lawyers challenged it. God
We even
damn,
had
bro.
Francis Biddle.
Yeah,
He
Francis
tried his
Biddle
best,
challenged
but
it.
there's only so much an individual can do in a scenario where the whole government is just for it.
Yeah, they were overwhelmed. You can't always rely on a few individuals inside the system to stop injustice. This script is not that good. Okay, here we go. That's why this history still matters today, because the lesson isn't just that the government made a mistake. The lesson is that a few voices weren't enough to stop it. And if we assume someone else will always step up, we risk letting history repeat itself.
And that ultimately means preventing injustice requires something much bigger than just a few brave individuals, such as Francis, what is his name, Biddle?
Francis Biddle. Yeah, yeah.
It requires awareness from the public, communities paying attention, and people being willing to question decisions made in moments of fear and war.
So when we ask the question, who will step up? history gives us a complicated answer. A few people will try, but sometimes that isn't enough, which means that responsibility doesn't just belong to leaders, it belongs to all of us.
And because once policies like these gain momentum, they become very hard to stop, which is, which is what we. The best way to prevent them is to recognize the warning signs early.
Now, that was part one of our podcast. We're going to go to commercial break. We'll see you in part two.
Thank you for listening to the KKC podcast. Go check us out on Spotify at the KKC. Check us out on YouTube. Check us out on Instagram. Go listen to our music. This is a preview of our music right here. Subscribe.
Okay, welcome back from that commercial break. I'm sorry that we had to do that, but we got to please the investors.
Thanks for tuning back in.
Yeah. Thank you for staying in there, sticking in there. I know it can be hard to pay attention. So, in the first part of this episode, we talked about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II and how more than 120,000 people were forced from their homes and placed into camps simply because of their ancestry. We also talked about something that gets overlooked often. There's actually were people who tried to resist this policy. Some journalists spoke out, some lawyers challenged it in court. Even a few government officials warned that it wasn't necessary, but despite these voices, the policy still happened. And that raises a really important question. If the people inside the government recognized that internment was wrong, why didn't they stop it? And if they couldn't stop it then, what does that mean for how much we should depend on the government officials to prevent injustices in the future?
That's a valuable insight that you've brought up. I think a lot of us grow up.
Yeah, that's some good insight right there. That's W insight.
That's some amazing insight right there. I think that most of us growing up believing that the system. What? Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us grow up believing that the system has some of these built-in safeguards. Like if something extreme starts happening, we assume someone in power will step in and pretty much say, hold on a second, this ain't right. Like maybe a senator will speak out or a court will rule something, but that didn't happen in this case. Actually, the opposite almost happened.
That's good. Those are some good points that you were making there. One of the biggest reasons that that was a good point. To add on to that, one of the biggest reasons, I don't know, that was a good point. I think, to add on to that, one of the biggest reasons that government officials didn't stop internment was political pressure. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, the United States entered World War II almost overnight. Fear spread rapidly across the country. People were worried about national security, sabotage, and the possibility for another attack. And when the public becomes afraid, politicians feel that pressure immediately. And, because politicians are elected officials, their decisions are heavily influenced by public opinion. And during times of crisis, that pressure becomes even stronger. Standing up for Japanese Americans during the war would have been extremely unpopular in many parts of the country. So politicians did argue against internment. Opponents could accuse them of being soft on national security. Dexter, if you want to add on to that.
I think that's a great point that you bring up.
W point.
And that's a great point you bring up. And to add on to that, during wartime, that kind of accusation could be pretty much career ending. Nobody wants to be the politician who gets blamed if something goes wrong. So the safer choice politically was to either support the policy or just outright avoid speaking about it entirely.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point.
And as I've mentioned earlier, we see this time and time again in history. When the public is afraid, politicians often follow that fear instead of challenging it. They want to please the people that they govern.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think those are some great points that you made there. Um, so Dexter, that's a good point. To continue on, another major reasons, another major reason officials didn't stop internment is that fear often outweighs evidence. Before the government decided to relocate Japanese Americans, there were already investigations looking into whether or not they actually posed a threat. One important report came from Curtis B. Munson. Yo, that's not a real guy, bro. Curtis Munson. Curtis Munson. That's not a that's not a real guy, bro.
Is he actually a guy? Dude, this is like the most underground person ever. When you search him up, like there's not even like a thing. You know what I'm talking about? Like
Yeah.
that little tab that pops up where it's
Yeah.
like died this, born this. Like it's a bunch of government files that pop up.
A famous individual.
Very,
Munson had been
very
asked to
prominent in this.
investigate. Yeah, very prominent. Munson had been asked to investigate Japanese American communities before the war and determine whether there were signs of widespread disloyalty or espionage. What he found out was pretty clear. Included that a vast majority of these Japanese Americans were loyal to the United States and did not represent a serious threat. But despite that report, the internment policy still continued forward. And what do you think about that decision, Dexter? That it still continued forward. What do you think that showed?
I mean, that just obviously shows that the decision wasn't really based on evidence. It was more of a reaction from the fear of the war. And once fear becomes a dominant force in decision making, facts don't always change the outcome.
I mean, that was a great point, Dexter. I think another factor that also made internment difficult to stop was the influence of the military during wartime. During World War II, military leaders had enormous authority over decisions related to national security. One of the most influential figures pushing for internment was John L. DeWitt, a very famous. He was in charge of the Western Defense Command. He was very famous, in charge of the Western Defense Command.
In this topic.
Yeah, everybody knows him. He argued that Japanese Americans on the West Coast could potentially assist an invasion or sabotage military operations. He famously claimed that the absence of sabotage actually proved that an attack might still be coming.
And when you really think about that, that's just a circular argument. He's pretty much saying we haven't seen sabotage yet. So that means it must be possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely outrageous.
He should resign from his post of Western Defense Command after that statement.
Yeah, I don't know how he's so famous after saying that. Crazy.
And arguments like these can be really powerful during war times where people are scared. And when people are scared, they often accept these worst case scenarios as justification for extreme action, such as internment.
Yeah, they often do. I agree. We've seen it firsthand. So, why is this why are many of the talking points, an issue today? It really is because, we have lots of, polarization.
Insurrections?
Insurrections. This is very important today because, there's a lot of political polarization, which means that people in the government will be even more, indecisive in trying to stand up because they're trying to maintain their position in the government, right? So they don't want to do any controversial thing. It's going to be very hard, if you want to be voted in to go against the wants of the American people, the citizens, even if it's constitutionally incorrect. Not right. So what does this really mean today? When we look at this history today, it really means We often assume that government officials will defend civil liberties when they are threatened, but history shows this assumption isn't always reliable. Political pressure, fear, military authority, and institutional momentum can all prevent officials from acting.
Beautiful insight. And to sum it up, that means protecting rights can't depend entirely on leaders inside the system. Because sometimes those leaders are the ones who are under the most pressure to not act.
That's exactly right, Dexter. I couldn't have said it better myself. So when we ask the question, why can't we depend on government officials to stop injustices like the internment? The answer isn't that they don't want to. Some do, some want to, but the system around them often makes it extremely difficult for these individuals to succeed and going against these things. Political incentives push leaders to follow public fear, to go against what's right under the Constitution. And all these forces combined make it risky to assume that a few officials will always step in to protect civil rights, which means that the responsibility can't rest solely with them. In fact, I would say that we in we can't assume at all. We have to assume that they're going to do nothing always. And because of this, it has to involve a broader awareness among the public, communities paying attention, citizens questioning decisions during moments of fear. And the internment of Japanese Americans is one of the clearest examples of that.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah. And as we come to a close of our beautiful podcast, the best podcast on Spotify, on YouTube, we would like to ask for your support if you so please. So if you want to go to Spotify and search up, we would greatly appreciate that. And thank you for listening. Dexter, you want to say anything to the audience, people at home, to this?
Love and support. Peace. See y'all on the next episode.
Yeah, we'll see you on the next episode. Whenever it comes out, we might, maybe 2-year anniversary, you'll make an episode. Who knows? Okay, guys, we'll see you in the next one.